Kandiohi County, Minnesota, October 1887. While every carpenter in the territory framed chimneys into their roof plans before laying the first log, Eino Virtanen was doing something that made the entire Finnish settlement question his sanity. The 36-year-old immigrant was building a cabin with no chimney at all, just a massive pile of granite stones in the center of his floor and a sealed roof overhead. "You'll fill our home with smoke and kill our children," his wife Liisa told him. The neighbors agreed. But Eino had watched too many families lose half their fire's heat straight up the flue. And if you want to find out what happened when the deadliest blizzard in Minnesota history put his chimneyless cabin to the test, subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Eino Virtanen had grown up breathing smoke, not as a hazard, as a way of life. In the forests of central Finland, his family had heated their home the same way their ancestors had for 1,000 years. Fill the room with smoke from an open fire. Let it heat the massive stones stacked floor to ceiling. Then open the vents and let the smoke escape. The stones held that heat for days. The savutupa, the smoke cabin, had kept Finns alive through winters that made Minnesota look mild. Temperatures of -40 were common above the Arctic Circle. Blizzards lasted weeks, yet Finnish families survived with fires so small an American would laugh at them, because they weren't heating air. They were heating stone. The principle was simple enough that a child could understand it. Fire makes heat. Heat rises with smoke. If you let that smoke escape immediately through a chimney, you lose most of the heat. But if you trap the smoke inside, let it swirl around massive stones until they absorb the energy, then release the smoke once the stones are hot. You've stored that heat in something that won't float away. 3 tons of granite holds warmth the way a cast iron stove never could. A stove cools within an hour of the fire dying. A stone mass stays warm for 3 days. Eino arrived in Minnesota in 1882, drawn by letters from cousins who'd settled near the Finnish communities around Kandiohi County. The land was cheap, the forest familiar, and the winters supposedly manageable for anyone who'd survived Finland. What he found instead was a mystery that haunted him through 5 American winters. Americans had heat. They had wood in quantities that would make a Finnish peasant weep with joy. They had iron stoves that glowed red hot and chimneys that drew perfectly. And yet they shivered constantly, burned through cords of wood at impossible rates, and sometimes froze to death in cabins that should have been warm. Eino watched his American neighbors and saw the problem immediately. Their chimneys worked too well. Heat rose, smoke rose, and both went straight out the flue before the cabin could capture any of it. A man would feed his stove for an hour, and 50 minutes of that heat would vanish into the sky. The cabin stayed warm only while the fire roared. The moment it died, the cold crept back in. In Finland, this would be considered madness, building a hole in your roof specifically designed to throw away heat. But Americans were proud of their chimneys, their iron stoves, their constant fires. They measured prosperity in cordwood stacked against the wall. By 1887, Eino had saved enough to build his own cabin on 40 acres of timbered land. His wife Liisa had borne him 2 children, a daughter of 4 and a son of 2, and the family had outgrown their rented room in the Finnish boarding house in Vilmar. It was time to build. Eino drew his plans in the dirt with a stick, explaining to Liisa what he intended. No chimney. A stone mass in the center of the cabin, floor to ceiling. Small vents near the roof that could be opened and closed. A firebox at the base of the stones where he would burn wood until the smoke filled the room and the granite glowed with heat. Liisa stared at the drawings, then at her husband, then at their children playing in the autumn leaves. "You want to fill our home with smoke, with the children inside. The smoke leaves before we enter. The heat stays. This is how people die, Eino. This is how Finns survive." Word spread through Kandiohi County before Eino had cleared the building site. A Finn was building a cabin without a chimney. The story seemed too strange to be true, so men rode out to see for themselves. They found Eino hauling granite boulders from a glacial deposit on his property, stacking them beside the cleared foundation. No chimney materials, no flue pipes, just stone after stone, hundreds of pounds each, piled like he was building a fortress instead of a home. His nearest neighbor, a Swedish immigrant named Anders Lindqvist, who'd farmed the county for 12 years, confronted him on the third day. Virtanen, where's your chimney going? Eino gestured at the stone pile. No chimney. The stones hold the heat. Lindqvist stared at him, waiting for the joke. When none came, his expression shifted from confusion to concern. You can't heat a cabin without a chimney. The smoke has to go somewhere. It goes into the room. Then it goes out the vents. The heat stays in the stones. That's not how it works. You'll suffocate your family before the first snow. That's how it's worked in Finland for 1,000 years. Lindqvist rode away shaking his head, convinced the Finn had lost his mind somewhere between the old country and the new. By evening, every farmer within 10 miles knew about the madman building a smokehouse for his wife and children. The Finnish community offered no support. These were modern Finns, men who'd left the old ways behind when they crossed the Atlantic. They built American cabins with American chimneys and American stoves. The savutupa was something their grandfathers had used. Primitive, dangerous, embarrassing. Eino was making them all look like backward peasants. A delegation of 3 Finnish settlers visited the building site in late October. Their spokesman, a merchant named Paavo Heikkinen, who'd lived in Minnesota for 15 years, addressed Eino with the careful patience of a man explaining something obvious to a child. We left the smoke cabins behind for a reason. This is America. We have iron stoves. We have proper chimneys. What you're building is what our great-grandfathers built before they knew better. Our great-grandfathers survived winters that would kill every American in this county. And now, we have better ways. You have ways that waste half your heat up the chimney. I've watched you burn 6 cords every winter while your children sleep in their coats. Heikkinen's face reddened. My children are warm. Your children would be warmer with stones that hold heat for 3 days instead of a stove that cools in an hour. The delegation left without another word. The following Sunday, the Finnish Lutheran pastor worked a reference into his sermon about the sin of pride and the foolishness of clinging to pagan ways when God had provided modern improvements. Half the congregation glanced toward Lisa, who sat rigid in the pew with her children, her face burning with shame. At the general store in Vilmar, a betting pool formed on a slate board behind the counter. Most wagers clustered around Christmas. The consensus held that the Virtanen family would abandon the smoke cabin by December 25th, or die trying to make it work. A few darker bets suggested they wouldn't last until the first hard freeze. The storekeeper added his own wager, $2 that the county sheriff would intervene before Thanksgiving, removing the children from a home that constituted obvious danger. Eino heard about the betting pool from a sympathetic customer who thought he deserved warning. He returned to his building site and kept hauling stones. 3 tons of granite. That's what he needed. He was almost there. The stone mass rose from the cabin floor like an altar to a forgotten god. Eino built it the way his father had taught him, the way his grandfather had taught his father. Granite boulders stacked in a careful spiral, largest at the bottom, progressively smaller toward the ceiling, with gaps between them that would allow smoke to penetrate deep into the pile. The structure measured 8 feet wide at the base and rose 7 feet to within a foot of the ceiling. 3 tons of stone occupying the center of a cabin that measured just 20 feet by 16. His neighbors thought he was mad, giving up a quarter of his living space to a pile of rocks. What they didn't understand was that the pile was the living space. Everything else, the beds, the table, the cooking area, existed to serve the stones. At the base, Eino constructed a firebox lined with flat granite slabs. The opening faced the cabin's entrance, allowing him to feed wood without walking around the mass. Above the firebox, the stones were stacked with deliberate gaps that created channels for smoke to rise and circulate. The smoke wouldn't simply hit the pile and stop. It would weave through the labyrinth of spaces, depositing heat into every boulder it touched. The cabin walls went up around the stone mass in early November, when frost already whitened the grass each morning. Eino worked faster now, racing the weather. Log walls, chinked tight with moss and clay. A sod roof over timber beams, sealed against leaks. And where every other cabin in the county had a hole for a chimney pipe, Eino's roof was solid. The only openings were 3 small vents near the roof line, each fitted with wooden shutters that could be opened or closed from inside using rope pulls. When closed, the cabin was nearly airtight. When open, they allowed smoke to escape once the stones had absorbed their heat. Anders Lindqvist rode past during the final days of construction and stopped to watch Eino fitting the vent shutters. "You're really going through with this." "The cabin's nearly finished." "It's not a cabin. It's a kiln. You're going to roast your family like pottery." Eino climbed down from the roof and faced his neighbor. "Come back in January. Feel the stones yourself. Then tell me I'm wrong." "I won't need to come back in January. I'll be helping the sheriff collect your bodies in December." Lindqvist rode away. Eino returned to work. The system's operation was simple, though it looked like madness to anyone unfamiliar with it. Each morning, Eino would send Lisa and the children outside. He would build a fire in the firebox, not a large fire, just enough to produce steady smoke for 2 hours. The smoke would fill the cabin completely, swirling around the stone mass, penetrating every gap and channel. The granite would absorb the heat greedily, the way a sponge absorbs water. When the stones were hot and the fire burned down to coals, Eino would open the roof vents. The smoke would pour out, first in thick clouds, then in wisps, then nothing. Within 30 minutes, the air would be clear. He would close the vents, and the family would enter. No smoke inside, just warm stones radiating heat into the living space from every direction. The floor near the mass stayed warm enough to sit on. The air temperature held steady without any fire burning at all. 3 tons of granite at 200 degrees would cool slowly, perhaps 10 degrees per day in mild weather, 15 in bitter cold. 3 days of heat from 2 hours of burning. No chimney constantly stealing warmth into the sky. On November 28, 1887, Eino lit the first fire in the completed cabin. The stones began to warm. Winter was 11 days away. By the second week of December, Eino Virtanen's cabin had become Kandiohi County's favorite spectacle. Farmers would ride past at dawn just to watch the smoke pour from the vents, thick gray clouds billowing from a cabin that had no chimney, as if the building itself were on fire from within. "The Finns smoking his family like hams," one farmer joked at the general store. The line got repeated so often it became the standard greeting when anyone mentioned the Virtanen place. Anders Lindqvist organized a formal visit in mid-December, bringing 3 other settlers to witness what he called the most dangerous dwelling in Minnesota. They arrived just as Eino opened the vents after the morning heating. Smoke poured from the roof in quantities that made the men step back involuntarily. "My God," one of them muttered. "The whole place is full of it." "Every morning," Lindqvist confirmed. 2 hours of smoke, then he puts his children inside. It's a miracle they're still breathing. They waited until the smoke cleared, then Lindqvist demanded entry. Eino obliged, opening the door to reveal his wife and children sitting comfortably near the stone mass. The air inside was clear. Not perfectly clean, but no worse than any cabin with a wood stove. The temperature was warm enough that Lisa wore only a light wool dress despite the December chill outside. "Feel the stones," Eino offered. Lindqvist pressed his palm against the granite and pulled it back immediately. The surface was hot, not burning but far warmer than any iron stove an hour after the fire died. "It's warm now," Lindqvist admitted. "But how long does it last? When the real cold comes, you'll be smoking this cabin every 4 hours just to survive. The stones hold heat for 3 days. Impossible. Come back in 3 days. Don't come earlier. Feel them then." Lindqvist didn't return. He didn't need to see more to know what he knew. The system was primitive, dangerous, and doomed to fail. The real cold hadn't arrived yet. When it did, when temperatures dropped to 20 below and stayed there for weeks, the Finn would discover what every other settler in Minnesota already understood. Heat required constant fire. Constant fire required a chimney. Without a chimney, you died. At the general store, the betting pool had grown to $63. New wagers arrived daily as word spread to neighboring counties. A newspaper reporter from St. Hochebri Cloud rode out to see the chimneyless cabin and wrote a mocking piece about old world superstition meeting new world reality. The article predicted tragedy by February. Sheriff Thomas Erickson paid a visit 3 days before Christmas, responding to complaints about child endangerment. He found the Virtanen children healthy, warm, and playing on the floor near the stone mass. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke, no worse than any home, and the temperature was comfortable despite no fire burning. "I don't understand how it works," Erickson admitted to Eino, "but I can't arrest a man for keeping his family warm." "Tell them at the store. Maybe they'll lose their wagers." "I'll tell them what I saw. They won't believe me." The sheriff was right. When he reported that the Virtanen cabin was warm and the children healthy, the bettors simply adjusted their predictions. The system might work in December. January would be different. January always was. On January 11, 1888, the sky turned a strange yellow-gray. The temperature at noon was a mild 32 degrees. Farmers commented on the pleasant weather, hoping the worst of winter had passed. By midnight, 236 people across the upper Midwest would be dead. The children's blizzard had arrived. The children's blizzard announced itself with a lie. January 12, 1888, dawned unseasonably warm across Minnesota and the Dakota Territories. Temperatures climbed above freezing. Children walked to school without heavy coats. Farmers worked outside in shirt sleeves, grateful for the midwinter thaw. Then the sky changed color. At approximately 3 in the afternoon, a wall of white appeared on the northwestern horizon, moving faster than a galloping horse. Within minutes, temperatures plunged 40 degrees. Within an hour, they dropped 60. Wind screamed across the prairie at 70 miles per hour, driving snow so thick and so fine that it filled every gap in clothing, every crack in walls, every breath a person tried to take. Children walking home from school vanished into the white. Some were found the next morning, frozen solid within sight of their own doors, doors they couldn't see through snow that reduced visibility to less than 3 feet. Teachers who kept students inside watched the schoolhouse walls bow inward from wind pressure, watched the fire in the stove devour wood faster than it could produce heat, watched the temperature inside drop despite flames roaring at maximum draft. The death toll would reach 236 across the upper Midwest. Many were children. Many were found in clusters, huddled together for warmth that never came, their bodies frozen in embraces that couldn't save them. In Kandiyohi County, the blizzard struck with particular fury. Anders Lindqvist was caught in his barn when the wall of white descended. He couldn't see his cabin 40 feet away. He tied a rope to the barn door and walked with one hand on the line, following it toward what he prayed was home. The wind knocked him down 3 times. The cold drove into his bones like nails. By the time he reached his door, his fingers were too numb to work the latch. His wife heard him screaming and pulled him inside. His cabin had a proper chimney, a good chimney, the best in the county, drawing perfectly. His stove was already burning when the blizzard hit. Within an hour, he was feeding it constantly, shoving in wood as fast as it would take, the draft roaring like a locomotive. The heat went up the flue as fast as he could produce it. The wind outside created such pressure that cold air forced itself through every crack, every gap, every space between logs. By midnight, with the stove glowing red and the woodpile diminishing fast, the temperature inside Lindqvist's cabin had dropped to 28 degrees. His children slept in their coats, wrapped in every blanket the family owned, huddled so close to the stove that sparks singed their bedding. 3 miles away, Eino Virtanen had seen the sky change color and understood immediately what was coming. He'd witnessed such storms in Finland, not often, but enough to recognize the signs. He brought his family inside, checked the stone mass with his palm, and made a decision. The stones were still warm from the morning's heating, perhaps 140 degrees at the core. Warm enough. He would not smoke the cabin during the blizzard. Opening the vents in this wind would be catastrophic. Instead, he sealed every gap, stuffed rags under the door, and trusted the granite. The blizzard raged for 18 hours. Wind shook the cabin walls. Snow forced itself through cracks Eino didn't know existed. The temperature outside dropped to 35 below zero, with wind chill pushing it beyond measurement. Inside, the stone mass radiated. 3 tons of granite doesn't care about wind. It doesn't care about outside temperature. It releases heat at the same steady rate regardless of conditions, perhaps 15 degrees per day in brutal cold. The stones had started at 140 degrees. After 18 hours of the worst blizzard in Minnesota history, they had cooled to perhaps 125. The cabin temperature never dropped below 42 degrees. Eino's children slept through the worst of it, wrapped in light blankets, their beds positioned near the stone mass. Lisa woke once during the night, listened to the wind howling outside, felt the warmth radiating from the granite, and went back to sleep. No fire burned, no smoke filled the room, no desperate feeding of logs into a hungry stove. Just 3 tons of stone releasing the heat they'd absorbed that morning, slow and steady, while the world outside froze solid. When the blizzard finally broke on the morning of January 13th, Eino opened his door to find drifts piled to his roofline. The sky was clear and bitter, 20 below zero in the still air. He could see smoke rising desperately from every chimney in the county, thin gray lines climbing into the frozen sky. He wondered how many of those chimneys had stolen their heat when it mattered most. Anders Lindqvist appeared at Eino's door on January 15th, 3 days after the blizzard. His face was haggard, his eyes hollow with exhaustion. Bandages wrapped both hands where frostbite had blackened his fingertips during the desperate rope walk from barn to cabin. "I burned 4 cords in 2 days, Lindqvist said without greeting. 4 cords. My stove never stopped. My children still shivered." Eino stepped aside and let him enter. Lindqvist stopped 3 paces inside, the same confusion crossing his face that had crossed Russell Caldwell's face in Montana, that had crossed Emmett Shaw's face in that other valley. The cabin was warm. Not survivable. Warm. Comfortable. His own home hadn't felt this warm since October. "The stones," Lindqvist whispered. "They're still hot? Feel them yourself." Lindqvist approached the granite mass and pressed his bandaged palm against the surface. Even through the cloth, he could feel the steady warmth radiating outward. 3 days after the last fire. 18 hours of the worst blizzard in memory. And the stones were still warm enough to heat the cabin. How is this possible? 3 tons of granite holds heat the way a bucket holds water. My stove holds perhaps 200 pounds of iron. When the fire dies, the iron cools in an hour. The granite takes 3 days. Lindqvist walked slowly around the stone mass, touching it at different heights, feeling the warmth everywhere. His engineer's mind was working now, calculating what he was experiencing against everything he'd believed about heating. "During the blizzard, you didn't burn anything?" "Nothing. The stones had enough from the morning heating. I didn't dare open the vents in that wind." "My chimney," Lindqvist's voice was quiet, understanding dawning. The wind created a draft. The harder I burned, the faster the heat went up the flue. A chimney is a hole in your roof designed to remove heat. In mild weather, this is fine. In a blizzard, it kills you. Eino showed him the records he'd kept since November. Temperatures measured with a mercury thermometer his wife's father had brought from Finland. Stone temperatures, air temperatures, wood consumption. The numbers told a story that contradicted everything Minnesota settlers believed about winter survival. 2 hours of burning each morning. Perhaps 30 pounds of wood. The stones absorbed the heat from smoke that would otherwise vanish up a chimney. 3 days of warmth from each heating, even in bitter cold. I burned 30 pounds an hour during the blizzard, Lindqvist said, staring at the figures. 30 pounds an hour and my cabin dropped below freezing. Your chimney worked perfectly. That was the problem. Lindqvist sat heavily on a bench near the stone mass, feeling its warmth against his back. Outside, the county was still digging out from drifts that had buried barns and blocked roads. The death toll was still being counted. Children were still being found frozen in fields within sight of their schools. Paavo Heikkinen's nephew died walking home, Lindqvist said quietly. The teacher let the children leave before the worst hit. The boy was found 100 yards from his door. I heard. Heikkinen came to your cabin, didn't he? Told you this was primitive. Told you the old ways were foolish. He did. Lindqvist was silent for a long moment, staring at the granite mass that had kept this family alive, while his own family shivered around a roaring stove. I want to learn, he finally said. Not for me. My cabin's built. But I have a brother coming from Sweden in the spring. His wife. Their children. He looked up at Eino. I won't let them build a chimney that steals their heat when they need it most. Eino poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot warming on a small trivet near the stones. When the ground thaws, I'll show you how to stack granite.